Hello, and welcome back to Parlay. This prompt was written by, let me see here, True Parley Grandmaster Foot is what you've changed it to now. On the Invisible Wall, Part 7, Mr. Foot says about the impossible choice in games. Can no longer playing the game be part of the narrative? That and much more in this episode of Abstract Art with the Foot. Today we will talk about something that every one of us has encountered, but maybe without thinking about it. Disclaimer, I will talk about a selection of games in this parlay. You don't need to play them to understand the topic of this parlay, as I will explain everything that is necessary to the discussion, but that also means I will spoil a bunch of stuff in this parlay. So here are the things that are going to get spoiled. The central plot twist of the original BioShock, the first third of The House in Fata Morgana, and the entire structure of both Undertale and Nier Replicant / Gestalt, which are sort of the same thing. Yeah, I would say having read this parlay over, the BioShock one is a pretty big spoiler. The Fata Morgana one, we're going to talk about it. I think if you would play that game, I'm not certain you would want to not know what we're going to talk about. I feel like you might be better off knowing, but it's a matter of opinion. And then the Undertale and Nier Replicant ones are pretty big, although the Nier Replicant one, I feel like the game plays its hand fairly early from what I understand. The Undertale one is fairly large if you somehow don't have any spoilers for how Undertale works yet. But that would be awesome though, so if you want to preserve that. Anyway, let's go. This parlay is extremely long. This is probably one of the best examples in a while of a parlay that reminds me of a scripting situation that I've been grappling with myself in my own videos, where I write these like 3-part videos, and then looking at the video, I think you could just make this 3 small videos. The thing about parlay is that it's kind of loaded in 2 different ways. The first one is that you do have to pay for each one. Now, Mr. Food has been doing parlay for years, so I have the confidence to say you probably aren't going to stop doing parlay right now, therefore you would consider just making this into like 4 in this case, is what I could see this being. But then 2, part of the interest of parlay is that you get to play around with covering topics in a certain amount of time, and I get to play around, I get to learn and kind of practice covering topics in a different amount of time. So I don't think it's bad that this is one parlay. You know, as I thought about it more, I read this parlay yesterday and I've just been thinking about it a little. I'm not sure if I think it would be better if it were divided, but just politely, since you've done a lot of parlay, I think this is one where that's worth considering. We're just going to do it, of course, but it made me think about that. It helped me develop more of an opinion about that, so I thought it might be nice to highlight that for all of you. Anyway, the point is, like, it's long, and so if I'm going to cover it all in one, we're going to have to go fairly quickly through some of the examples, but I'll do my best. First of all, we have BioShock and no lack of initiative. Mr. Foot starts, the entirety of the narrative for BioShock rests on 2 moments, the allure of the opening scene and the would you kindly moment. In BioShock, you play as Jack, exploring the dystopian underwater city of Rapture. You're guided by a man named Atlas, who tells you to do a series of tasks in order to take down the reigning ruler and founder of the city, a man named Andrew Ryan. In your ultimate encounter with Andrew Ryan, he reveals that Atlas has been controlling Jack, and by extension the player, by using the phrase, would you kindly, something Atlas has said before, giving you every mission in the game. Andrew Ryan chooses to prove that he is no slave, to prove he is a free man, by choosing how he dies. He tells Jack to kill him. At this point, the game takes control away from you by forcing you to watch as Andrew Ryan is slaughtered in a cutscene. Both Jack and you, the player, are slaves, having never questioned the objectives the game presents you with, and this is the result. But is this true? What if you, the player, had questioned the objectives? Would you be able to do anything about Atlas's control? Well, no, not really, because the game cannot progress unless you follow the objectives. Like, there isn't a gameplay loop in the game that would handle that. You don't have the choice to do anything but the thing he says. So the player could never have had free will in the first place. But this is where we arrive at the impossible choice. The player always has at least one way to oppose the story, to stop participating in it. In the case of BioShock, the player can always exit the game of BioShock to escape Atlas's control? Is it appropriate to oppose the game by choosing to stop playing? And more importantly, what would we achieve by doing that? This is the thing I like about Mr. Food Parlay. I don't think it would be interesting to prompt a discussion about whether people do this. We don't know. The interesting thing is, but what significance does that have? I think this is a very good starting example. This is a thing that's probably happened to a lot of us, where the game says, oh, you had no idea this thing was happening. But in fact, occasionally when that type of twist occurs, I think I did suspect that was happening, actually. And generally, I think it's kind of one of two things has happened. Either one, I confirmed already that the game didn't give me the option to do something else. And so although I suspected that something was amiss, I knew I couldn't, or thought I knew I couldn't change like the outcome. I couldn't do anything. I wonder, I can't at the moment think of any, but I can imagine it would be very frustrating if you were in that situation and discovered there actually was something you could do to kind of resist the game's influence, but it was obscure enough that you genuinely tried to find it, but didn't, but it was there. You see what I mean? So I do think one of the pitfalls here is that to get the player to kind of move along in the narrative, a lot of the time, these types of conceits in games, maybe not always as blunt as this BioShock one sounds like it is, will make it seem as though you don't have much of a choice, though occasionally you do, and it would be quite frustrating for the player if they suspected that they really could choose, but then failed to find the choice available. I am more concerned than I would normally be, because this feels like a playtesting thing. Like, you would get that better if you playtested a lot, which, as I will never stop shutting up about until it gets better, is one of the gaming industry's biggest weaknesses, in my opinion. I feel like most games, the thing that would improve the game the most for the least time would be to have more people who like play video games normally, play the game, give feedback, and then have the developer iterate on that. Many times including literally just numerical changes in the code. Nothing at all that involves like adding new content. But in this case, it might be harder to rebalance, right? You can imagine that exactly how the game signals a different option being available, or subtle ways in which a more open-ended game kind of funnels you into certain parts of the world. You'd probably have to fiddle around with those things to carefully craft an experience that makes the player feel like they have a choice, but they don't just feel like they're supposed to do the thing that is resisting the game. Which brings me to the second reason, or the second way I often feel in these cases, which is that sometimes it feels like the conceit of the game, I'm meant to suspend my disbelief. You know what I mean? I'm meant to notice that this is a bit, I don't know about this motivation, but I'm meant to just go along with it. Another way to kind of remix this is that it could be a writing problem. It might be that I don't take the kind of threat of the world seriously because I think it is badly written. It just doesn't impact me. And therefore I think, well, but it's not a big deal. We will get back to that in many ways over the course of this parlay. The idea that the player's level of experience with the type of material the game is dealing with, free will, control, making things worse by trying to do the right thing, is a topic we'll come back to in a little. How these types of things, the amount of experience that the player has with those subjects may be a significant barrier to the game kind of doing its thing. If it wants you to think, oh, did you really think about not killing all these people? It's like that may just not have the impact that it needed to for me to think, oh, I'm meant to have a serious moral quandary here. There is a bit of, I hate to say it this way, but we don't have time for me to sugarcoat it. So there's a bit of, I don't live under a rock game. Like, I've thought about this before. And then maybe the game goes, whoa, you never thought about how bad this is. And I go, yeah, man, I just think I already think about that a lot. It's like not a big revelation to me that could be the case. And I feel bad in that case because the game may have been able to get me to take it seriously by more thoroughly putting me in the shoes of like the character in the game that I'm meant to stand in for. I, a disillusioned nerd, Absolutely still have emotional reactions, readily have emotional reactions. I will like tear up fairly readily if I perceive humans, going through a meaningful thing, even though I, Zandy Pants, do not think that that thing is like touching or meaningful. I think, that doesn't matter to me, but it matters to you, and my empathy thing in my brain or whatever, I don't know, is firing, and so I react to that. You absolutely can get somebody who doesn't live under a rock to enjoy this kind of twist, but I think the important thing is to make it feel like they, as the player, and the character that they're inhabiting, you need to reconcile those differences. The character has to feel believably like they are in the proper situation for the thing to have impact. Good enough character writing. We need to see where the character is as a person a little, maybe, is what I'm thinking about that. And then the player needs to be given a reasonable opportunity to resist those things. The topic of this one, though, ultimately is like, what about literally turning the game off? Which I'm sort of avoiding in this particular case, because as far as I can tell, it isn't yet like in the text of the game as per se. So what I mean by that is that it doesn't sound to me like BioShock at all suggests that you would kind of stop playing the game. BioShock is, to be blunt and a little bit mean for the sake of time, though, seemingly somewhat ignorant of the discussion that we're having currently, or it maybe predates that discussion a little bit. Fine, but I think it will be more meaningful to talk about that more in follow-up games. It seems like, as Mr. Foot concludes this section, this question so far is a bit of an academic curiosity. And the topic today are going to be games where the choice to stop playing might be the correct choice after all. And according to me, it is in the text of the games that we're going to talk about next to shut the game off. Not usually because the game tells you to quit in the middle, usually using multiple playthroughs. So we'll get into those examples. I don't have too much more to say about the BioShock one, though. So this one is the House in Fata Morgana and an immoral choice. The basic plot of the House in Fata Morgana is that you're the master of said house, and you are trying to figure out who you are. You're aided by the maid of the house as you learn the stories of the house's various former inhabitants. After 15-ish hours of gameplay, and a particularly badly written story, the maid reveals that your identity is that of the last story's protagonist, the last story within the story of the game. At this point, you have the choice to accept or reject her revelation. Both options lead to you rolling credits and ending the game. The interesting thing about that choice is that it only comes 15 hours into a 35-hour game. There's a third choice that the game never tells you anything about unless you wait for a minute before making your choice. It appears after you, AFKing on the screen for a minute. You get the ability to call out the fact that the final story was badly written, identifying it as a lie. This gives you the option to force the maid into revealing the truth despite the maid's pleas for the truth to remain hidden. This is interesting for several reasons. First of all, this is another case of art being kind of bad on purpose, which is interesting by itself, topic of a previous Invisible Wall parlay. But more importantly, on an ethical level, this is a morally gray choice, because you force someone to do a thing against their will. Is it acceptable to force someone to tell you the truth despite their probably good reasons to lie? You are warned that both the master and the maid will be forced to relive unspeakable horrors once you commit to that choice. And is it okay for a game to hide 2/3 of its content behind what many will consider an immoral decision? Is it maybe better to quit the game at the 15-hour mark, accepting the unsatisfying ending? You can probably see what I meant by, turning off the game being in the text of this one, right? It's not that the game tells you to turn it off, but the game asks you to make a decision, which, if you understand the consequences of the decision for you, the player outside the game, we'll come back to that in a sec, you are choosing basically to shut off the game if you say yes or no, or to not shut off the game if you say that last story sucked, you're lying to me. Does that make sense? The game isn't literally telling you to shut it off. But if you understand that the significance of that choice as a player, then the first two choices are shut the game off, and the third choice is do not shut the game off, continue playing the game, or continue playing the game in future play sessions is like more or less the same thing, effectively the same thing as shutting the game off literally right now, right? You might hit, that last story was crap, you're lying to me, and then have to stop playing for now. But the point is, you picked an option that means the game continues. You get it. So the thing about this, there's a lot of things here. The first concern for me is that the choice is not necessarily clear to the player. There's this thing in games with the whole like hiding the real choice. So like the 1 minute thing really bothers me. Now, Mr. Foot might not literally mean 1 actual minute. Like it might be longer than that, or it might be shorter than that. I sort of feel like this type of decision point is like you can't get it right somehow. You know what I mean? One of the reasons is that people just take a while on such decisions, or don't. You know what I mean? Again, this is something about whether the game has the appropriate, I guess, gravitas for the player to feel like, oh, I should be taking my time on this choice. If you weren't like taking the game that seriously previously, perhaps because it was deliberately badly written for this plot point, you might make the decision quickly, even though you, as a player who thought the last story was badly written, you were the person who would have said, hey, that story was badly written. But because you're not taking the story that seriously at this point, you just click through it and you don't even see that third option reveal, when I would argue that third option is for you. It is for that type of player, but they'll rush through it. So that's some of what I meant when I said it depends on the player understanding the full meaning of the choice they're making. It doesn't just mean seeing the third option, though that's important. And it doesn't just mean feeling like the story is, I guess, serious enough to warrant that contemplation, well written enough to warrant that contemplation, though that's also important. It also means understanding that saying yes and no immediately ends the game, and then the third option is an unusual level of madness where the game will go on for more than its length so far. I think most players are interested in playing more of that, but simply wouldn't assume that a game would do such a thing. There's this kind of whole, you can see what I meant, by the way, when I said you could totally do 4 parlays on each of these individual sections, because there's lots in here. But with the limited time we have, the thing that comes to mind for me is how there's this difference between games not being obsessed with you seeing everything there is to offer, and games kind of like almost spitefully hiding parts of themselves from the player. I'm going to give you 2 lightning fast examples. So Hollow Knight is a game that has many, many optional bosses and very open nonlinear routing. You can do a lot of what would be sequence breaks, points in the game where you kind of bypass the order of events as it's meant to happen. But Hollow Knight has actually accounted for those. That's a mildly famous aspect of Hollow Knight in the speedrunning community. You can relatively sequence break the game and do things in what feels like it is the wrong order a little bit, but the game just works normally and perfectly if you do that. It's kind of softly intended. Pretty interesting. And there are a lot of optional bosses. Hollow Knight also has a kind of post-game, I guess minor spoiler for Hollow Knight, but I'm not going to talk about it much, just that after you beat like the final boss, there is a further thing you can do. Now, I wouldn't say most of the game or content of Hollow Knight is necessarily after that point. You know what I mean? It's not that it's really short or anything, but I wouldn't say you kind of missed the game. My point is that it's a matter of degree to some extent. Yeah, Hollow Knight has a bunch of bosses it doesn't force you to find, but essentially only because of its nonlinear progression. The developers just aren't obsessed with making you go everywhere. They want you to just get to discover things. They don't want you to not find the bosses. Well, I mean, I don't know their life, maybe they do, but the game isn't built to like make it hard or something for you to find the bosses. They just don't obsess about directing you toward them. You see what I mean? All things being equal, you'll just run around and have fun and mostly find the bosses and not have to worry about completionism. It's not the same thing as kind of actively hiding that other part of the game. My other example is Noita. This is a game that appears to be a kind of random wand. The wands are like guns or programs, sort of. We can't explain that right now. Random wand gun making roguelike game. It seems like you spawn in on the surface and you go down and you get wands that you have to decipher properly, or they might explode in your face and kill you, or be a world-ending machine gun of destruction, and you progress through and see how far you can get. What's unknown is that, again, I guess minor spoilers for Noita, but you can see how much disdain I have for this piece of game design, so I'm not sorry, I'm just warning you. That in Noita, you can actually kind of keep the same run going sort of forever, because there are infinite parallel universes to the left and right. But this is really hidden by the game. I would go so far as to say it feels like the game is sort of spiting the player, trying to find this kind of thing out. There are parts of the game where they say, oh, there might be something here, and then you go for hours and there's nothing there. That is not the same thing as the developer just not worrying about if you find those things. The developer is in, I would go so far as to say, an antagonistic relationship with the player, almost to push their buttons, as per se. I believe possibly for social media attention, but that's truly a topic for another time. Anyway, I think that's juvenile. And I kind of feel like the whole another option appears if you wait for a minute is on the spectrum between those two things. It's not the developer is, I'm sorry, developer of Noita, but like arguably being kind of a jerk. And the Hollow Knight situation where like nothing bad is happening here. It's just the structuring thing. I believe that the waiting a little bit for the choice thing is, it's a little, I don't know. There's something a bit off about that to me, where does the developer feel a little bit like only the chosen few who are edgy enough to tell people to suffer can get into this story? And it's like, no, man, most of the people that will do that just like got a drink at that point in the story. I think it basically doesn't work for a variety of reasons. And the impact is a little random, depending on the player's outside situation. It's much more likely that something that has nothing to do with how the player feels will determine which one they pick, rather than that they like want to make people suffer and there's just such an edgelord that they want to pull back the curtain, pick up the rock and see the bugs underneath, and that's why they pick the other option. Like, no, I think most of the time it's essentially an accident if that happens. And another point that we're going to get back to later is that at the Mr. Foot Mix later, is that it's often the case that the player will pick that option just because they want more game, because they purchased or got invested in the game and they just want more game, or they want to finish the game. In some ways, this sort of explains why the game wouldn't make it clear to you that if you pick the third option, that's where like the other half of the game is. Because if you did that, way more people would pick that option just like because that's where the rest of the content is. You see what I mean? Not telling the player that that option does that thing feels like it's getting the player to make a more moral choice. They're saying based on how they feel. And if they're willing to say, hey game, I'm willing to go to a dark place, then you hit that button and you play like the dark side of the game. I almost like that, because it's sort of like asking the player for consent, or giving the player like a very weird version of a trigger warning. It's almost like the game is trying to give the player a personality test. It's just that all that other complaining that I just did in this section, I don't think it actually works most of the time, but in theory, it's an interesting idea, I guess, and makes turning the game off sort of part of the text, in that you decide whether you want the story to go there. Even further, it could just be, do you want to deal with those kind of themes right now? Again, kind of the trigger warning thing, but also just, is that the kind of game you want right now? We will also get back to that point later, but we need to move on to Undertale and the inability to learn. There's a certain thing about the Undertale discourse that has been bothering me, Mr. Foot continues. To overly simplify, Undertale is a story about doing the right thing, no matter how hard it is. The story forces you to choose between the violent and non-violent option for every enemy you encounter. One of the conceits of Undertale is that you can kill or non-violent defeat every enemy you encounter in the game. Sometimes one choice is easier than the other, and sometimes you don't notice the existence of this choice until it's too late. Your first playthrough, and sometimes will almost certainly follow the path of least resistance, and at the end of the game game basically tells you that you've messed up. You can now retry. It's possible to play the entire game without ever using the violent option, and this leads to a happy ending, the game's message being that violence is bad and you should try to do the right thing even if the right path is difficult or obscure. What a nice, simple story. But we can't have nice things. Of course, you could play the game in a way that opposes the entire message and kill everything. No one in their right mind would do this their first playthrough or after internalizing the game's message, but if you were to go that route, you would reach a bunch of new content that pushes Undertale's combat to its breaking point, while also expanding the world and the characters of the game. If you fall through to the end, the game rightfully calls you out for not learning your lesson. It's a bad time. This path is also beloved by the community, and it dominates the discourse around the game, with many people going as far to say that you haven't properly played the game if you haven't experienced this path. One of the obvious reasons for this is that the game calling you out is a massive reset of expectations for many people. So here we are. Through the way people interact with the game, its message has changed. It's now about how people will disregard the message of a story and do horrible things if it's justified by curiosity or community pressure. Was this intended? Are you wrong for quitting the game after experiencing the pacifist route? Ooh, yeah. Okay, so this, and obviously I'm cheating here a little because obviously I read the parlay before, but you can see this point developing on what I was saying in the previous section about how the game may have its idea of what the choice is meant to be, but I don't think that's usually how people choose. This is an extreme example where it seems like the community has basically hijacked the game's messaging a little bit. Now, before we talk about the community influencing the game's message, I do think it's important to keep in mind how relatively few people, in terms of the population overall, statistics have told us, where I've seen them anyway, read outside sources. You know, it's not like everyone who plays the game has read the online materials. I have a feeling it's a lot of people, you know, maybe half of all players of a lot of games do look stuff up on the internet or see things on social media, especially it being a little automatic nowadays is part of why I think it's probably more widespread than previous metrics I heard like 10 years ago that were like 20% of people look stuff up, which sounds low because you're someone who does look those things up. You feel like you have tons of examples of people around you who do like look stuff up on the internet about games they play. So it feels crazy that half or 80% of people wouldn't do that, but that's that perspective trick. Like, just because you have dozens of examples, it doesn't mean that that sample size means anything at all. That's nothing. It's a drop in the bucket. But I do still feel like nowadays that is a significant amount of people playing the game. Even more, I feel like it's pretty likely that if people recommend you a game nowadays, they are more likely to be in the group of people that were influenced by the discourse on the game, if that makes sense. Which skews it a little because it means that even if you don't look up materials about the game during your playthrough, you may have been introduced to it and told this, like, you know, killing everything focused run situation by the person who recommended you the game. You might be influenced by that even if you don't look stuff up. So further, we dig into this idea that you could keep playing. The game gives you an option in the text of the game to turn the game off or keep playing. It suggests that you're kind of meant to play again if you're interested. And then if you do the pacifist route, then you know, the game says, hey, good job. Even though you could play more and do the kill everything route and, you know, get a different message or whatever. But again, having content hidden behind the moral choice somewhat undermines the situation. This is going to be a big problem in section 4 because it creates a kind of conflict where to motivate the player to deal with harsher themes but have it still be a game, you need there to be content in those harsher theme materials. But because the harsher materials contain new gameplay elements, the player is very likely to simply tolerate whatever material is in there just to get at the new gameplay. I do feel slightly troubled by how nowadays it's not the same situation as we had before, where this might be your only game you bought, you know, and so you kind of need to play everything this game has for you because this is the game you have with your allowance for the next 3 months. Nowadays, there are so many good games that are, you know, free or reasonably cheaper than your $60 asking price or whatever, that I personally feel like it's kind of not as much of a thing. It's not as reasonable to worry about having the amount of content, you know, be enough, like getting the most out of every single game. But people don't think that way. I'm just saying that objectively, there really is enough game nowadays. People still don't do that for the most part, as far as I can tell. People have a tendency to just finish everything. I'll tell you, I don't. I think something that has been very valuable to me about covering this stuff for a living is that I've learned to drop media that I'm truly not enjoying, but I just feel a compulsion to finish, which has made my life much, much better. And not just in that I don't spend time with something that's a slog. It also means I'm more willing to try things because I'm more comfortable dropping them if I don't like them. I don't feel like, oh, if I try this, it's like I'm going to be forced or sucked in or something to playing a lot of it, which makes me need to make decisions way overly cautiously. No, like that's not fun. And it's not healthy. It's just kind of hard to, get invested in something and then just drop it. But making that a habit has made me a much happier person. In any case, we were talking about how I think people have a tendency to just finish the thing. Like if they feel like a way to play is available, they're going to have a tendency to just do it. There's a limit. I will say that in my experience of Baldur's Gate 3, the game kind of suggests, from my point of view, that you play through with a custom character, with the Dark Urge special custom player character, and with each of the Origin companions. But I don't consider the Origin companion playthroughs to be a dense enough experience. And I think because there's just too many. Like, it would just take too long. You'd have to play through the whole massive hundreds of hours game like 8 times or more, probably. And I just can't. And so there's a way in which the game has kind of freed me up from that. That is a possible solution here, to get the player to just admit that they won't be able to play through all this stuff, for most people anyway. So you enjoy the game, and then you really have to choose because there are enough options that you simply can't do all of them. And I don't see how you would do that in some of these games because they kind of have to have only a few defined routes. And Baldur's Gate 3 is kind of cheating and made by people who, I don't know what's in the food they're feeding those people, who basically overcame that difficulty by making an absurd amount of content. That's just not feasible for most games. So while this is in theory a solution, in my opinion, give the player enough choices that they're not going to pick a choice just to get to more content, because there is infinite content they could experience essentially without making that choice, meaning it really is them choosing that specific thing a little bit more. Does that make sense? Another way to put this would be, what if the house in Fata Morgana gave you gameplay stuff, further gameplay stuff, maybe less or whatever, if you pick the first 2 options as well, different things too, then you could see how, because the player isn't missing content or thinks like, does the game end? The game ended right after that choice. Maybe I should try to make the third choice, or like wait and see if there's anything else, they would maybe then not feel like that, and they'd maybe be more making the choice based on whether they like actually wanted to. I don't know. That's my 2 cents. I definitely don't think it's wrong. Should I even answer this? After what I said, it kind of goes without saying. I obviously don't think it's wrong, or who even cares what I think. If you stop playing Undertale after the pacifist route, people are just being nerds, of course. That being said, it does frustrate me a little bit as a designer that games have this itch that designers want people to not experience the whole part of their game like that. I don't like it. I don't like it for a lot of reasons, but one of them is that I really think there's a bit of edgelordiness here on the part of some of the players and developers, where they think that it's going to be because they're making this big choice, but in reality, most of the people playing it has absolutely nothing to do with the gameplay itself. It's just because they want to be part of the conversation for the game, or whatever, of the mechanics of the game, not, because the moral theme is engaging to them. And again, politely, have you not thought about this before? You know what I mean? There is still an element here of, I like Mr. Fruit when you said one of the obvious reasons for a lot of people like wanting to experience the kill everything route is that the game calls you out, and that's a massive reset of expectations for many people. But I feel like it I can't say it shouldn't be, but more than many times that I've said such things, I mean that. I guess I just feel like that means that the game sort of relies on the player being somewhat sheltered, or like not having had thought about that before, to have impact maybe only to people who just don't know better yet. But I really feel like if you just play games for a while, you ought to have gotten to know better. But what do I even mean by should in this case? So I don't know. I guess I'm just saying that I feel like that is a somewhat low bar for the game to be clearing. And I think it's important to keep in mind that while it's fantastic if you enjoy these things, everybody is going to have a few games that are kind of a mix up in expectations for them. Like, it's not I don't even really know how to say this. It's just a lot of players basically just declare something a masterpiece if it is the first thing that happens to switch up their expectations, and don't go on to have the perspective that that's commonplace. Like that isn't like a special, unique, or particularly even difficult thing to do. And while it's great and all, like cool, it doesn't. Players really tend to overblow such things. I find this happens with a lot of media, but this is a particularly good example that I'm getting slightly frustrated about. But it's a fantastic example. I'm getting frustrated because it is a good example of this. Near Replicant and the Burden of Knowledge. We have one more game to examine, one without harsh breakpoints. A slow descent into misery. That game is 2010's Near Replicant, or Gestalt, depending on your console. A game directed by the one and only Yoko Taro. A fun JRPG about a beautiful young anime boy who's trying to save his Oni-chan shouting little sister from a magical disease. He's opposed by dark monsters, the Shades, and gathers a band of misfits in opposition, a band that includes a sexy lady named Kaine, whose clothing barely qualifies as lingerie. It's like a weird mix of, like, biker clothes and lingerie. Yeah, it's odd. I looked up this character design. I'm not a fan, actually. I love me some, I don't know, cute girls in lingerie, I guess, but it didn't work for me. A game that ends with the defeat of the evil Shadow Lord. So far, so JRPG. There would be little to talk about if this was the whole game. The thing is, it's not the whole game. After you roll credits, there are lots of unanswered questions. What are Shades? Why did the village elders try to prevent you from facing the Shadow Lord? Why was the Shadow Lord barely resisting? And what happened to Kaine afterward? Among the mountain of questions that drive you to return to the game for a New Game Plus are these. I messed up the reading, I'm sorry. And what you find in New Game Plus are answers. Answers that give context to your actions. Answers that make you realize that you've done horrible things and it's too late to do anything about it. If you're not satisfied with New Game Plus, you can dive into New Game Plus 2. By now you know the plot and you begin to rapidly outscale the combat, removing all joy from it. You now begin to focus on the details as the game drip feeds you information. The details will horrify you. The entire game in every aspect is permeated by one question. Do you want the sweet lie or the hard truth? Once you know what the hard truth is, there's no longer any choice left. If you can't or don't want to hear the truth anymore, there's only one way out: to stop playing. Mr. Food also included a video as a recommendation to kind of explain the way the game does this. And I did watch that video. I have actually a lot of thoughts. I could probably do a parlay literally just only on, I'm not trying to accuse you of making the parlay too long. You can do whatever you want, although it is hard to keep it in the time limit. Just that there's a lot here. I think it's a good topic. That's all. It's meant to be a compliment. However, I do not compliment this video. I thought it was truly awful, like one of the worst videos I've ever watched. I thought it was badly written, badly read, with bad audio quality and bad pacing, and everything was bad. However, I'm happy that I watched it for two reasons. The first one is that it explained to me the mechanics that you're referring to here. Mr. Food is trying to distinguish this from the way Undertale does things, where it's not like there's a normal playthrough and a good playthrough and a bad playthrough, but that here it's more like the deeper you go, you uncover more details, you try to do more things, and generally it just makes things worse. And you could just keep going, but it just makes things worse, which is going to be important for this game. The idea that you can often follow up on a lot of quests, and it almost always, it sounds like, makes things worse than they were before for everybody involved, and you can just kind of keep going and getting more content. You can see where we're going with this, and it just keeps making things even worse. I think that that's key here, and this may be the solution we're looking for. And second of all, because while the way that the video was read was, in my opinion, extremely terrible and annoying, it made me realize that one of the reasons I felt that way was actually just because I'm sick of things being like miserable, and of course things are just awful and stuff like that, right? What I've been saying this whole parlay about, do you live under a rock? Have you really not thought about this stuff before? Not to Mr. Food or anyone in particular, just like people who go, whoa, this story was so deep. It's like, it's not. Like, why don't you just think about life being bad sometimes? Like, what? Like, were you born yesterday is how I feel. But you know what? Because I feel like that, that's also part of the reason why I'm not as interested in this subject. Because to me, it feels like, why do you need even more of that? Like, there's no point. Like, you can just do anything and look at anyone anywhere and see more of this happening. There's no need to like tell the story of that thing. But you know what? If people aren't as exposed to that, whatever. I mean, it makes more sense in that case. It's because I'm exhausted by that I don't need that. Not every piece of media is made for me. Fair enough, That being said, I do think that makes me a good example. One, because a lot of people feel that way. I'm sure I'm not at all the only person. I think I perceive that as being common, but who knows? But certainly there are other people who feel like that. And two, because it lets me dig into, okay, but why do you keep playing the game? It's not for this insufferable material, insufferable to me. It would be for, like other stuff, the gameplay, the Ludo narrative, and not just the narrative. Okay, and so the interesting example here to me is that this game is kind of doing what I was suggesting before. What if you made a lot of different paths? Okay, well, what about a variation of that? Not a ton of different paths, just single quests and all, but you can keep going for a while, except each step makes things worse. Does the player want to keep getting content at the expense of like more negative feedback? Will the player's empathy center fire enough to make them stop when they know they'll get more content, but it's just going to be bad? Again, there is a part of me that prickles a little bit. Like, do you actually want to make a game, or do you just want to make a social experiment? But you don't want people to consent to the social experiment. You want to make it as a game. And so you're just kind of wrapping the game up in your weird social experiment. And then that makes me think, do you really not know what's going to happen? You know what I mean? Like, obviously some people are just going to do it out of completionism and be miserable. And other people will think it's a masterpiece because they live under a rock and haven't experienced this before. And other people are going to think it's asinine because they don't live under a rock and experience this all the time. Like, why do you want to make this game, Yoko Taro? I have a real bone to pick in this parlay that I didn't know I had in me. Bones I didn't know were in my body, toward Yoko Taro from doing this series, which I'm not mad about. I'm into it. I don't hate it. I don't hate this person as much as I do want more of an explanation of why. I feel like there isn't a good reason to make a game like this. But if you are going to make a game that is asking people to make those moral choices, I think the approach here is quite interesting, like makes sense if I'm understanding it correctly. Asking the player to just keep going rather than content, no content. There's content everywhere, and the game is just saying, you want even more content? It's gonna be bad. You're gonna be sad if you do more. You still gonna go, And then these games are kind of long, and I think in this case it sort of makes sense, because you could argue, I will present a reading, that you are meant to stop at some point. You're supposed to get tired of it and stop. And the text is very long, not so you'll complete it, but so there's enough runway that you will stop before you get to the end. That's the idea. If you get to the end, then you arguably miss the point in this reading I'm presenting, because it's supposed to get you to understand that completionism is bad. I don't know. That I just hate completionism, but but that making this choice to continue meddling isn't good. There's a particularly brutal twist a couple of playthroughs in, it sounds like, that I won't talk about with one of the main characters. But it leads to more game content. You know, it's like you get to play more. But I like what you said, Mr. Food, about like you begin to rapidly outscale the combat. Like it gets bad. It's just like there's more there. Now, I think there is still a minor flaw here, which is that a lot of players might be, I'm going to refer to it as fearful, or having a fear of missing out, a little FOMO, that they need to suffer through all of this because there might be like a final twist that would either undo it all, make it all good. It was all a dream, or something awful, actually. That would be terrible, but or just that kind of explains things further. And so they would want to keep going, even though they have learned their lesson and want to stop getting more content. It's not worth it. It's just going to be negative. The storytelling is hurting me or impacting me or whatever. But I'm still going to keep going because what if there's like a further plot detail there? I think creating a structure in the story where things kind of break down in a systematic way, like the story could possibly somehow reassure you that you essentially know all plot details, but things just get worse. Like, for example, the story could say reality will degrade every time you loop through the story. So you can keep going, but it's gonna be the same thing as before. Things are just going to decay over time. The levels will shred to pieces, and characters' dialogue will get darker and darker. Now, you might want to go see those things, but the game is trying to reassure you, if it structures itself that way, that you're not missing parts of the plot. The plot is just going to break over time. You see what I mean? I don't think that Nier Replicant is structured this way exactly, though it did kind of a little bit sound like maybe a little it might be structured that way. But you can imagine how you could make a game with this model where you complete the machine of getting the player to kind of exhaust their desire to keep making choices, keep getting content that just makes things worse, by making enough that they'll run out before they complete it all, making the game, things are consistently bad, basically. The world is consistent in the game, so the player like learns to expect that. You might need to make them basically always bad. Anyway, and making it clear to the player that the first playthrough or so, you know, this second or something, has given them all of the relevant plot information and probably gameplay mix-ups. If a few gameplay loops don't add new gameplay mix-ups, that should be enough. Letting the game become like a little bad, or like you outscale the combat a little bit, for this purpose seems kind of sensible. And I find that this isn't so bad in general. Like when I replayed Lies of P, I largely outscaled the combat, and that felt like a good, it was decent as a way to help me decide when I was done with the game. I enjoyed playing through most of a second playthrough, and then like that was enough for me. I was happy, and I left happy. The Lies of P doesn't do this type of thing at all, by the way. You just can do new game pluses. So cool. I do think it's interesting to have structured a game this way. I still hate it, and I'm not interested at all. And I'm sort of happy you spoiled these things for me in the way that a piece of media you want to know the story of, but think you will hate playing. It's kind of delightful sometimes to read the Wikipedia entry or whatever. This was like that for me. I'm actually happier because you told me more about the plot of these games, because I would almost certainly greatly dislike all of these experiences. I don't care. I'm not interested. It's just not for me. But I'll tell you, I personally think if you were interested, people listening, in any of these, it kind of feels to me like it would be worth playing some of them just to see what that experience would feel like. Maybe one of them, and then see how you feel. They're long though, these big ass games. Anyway, all right, let's finish up. Mr. Fruit says, in our 3 examples, that was 4 examples, Mr. Fruit, but okay, the player is arguably better off if they stop playing before exhausting all the content the game has to offer. But I would argue that all of the examples are still tame. There's no real damage to anyone. The questions in this parlay closely relate to the idea of completely experiencing a piece of art. Could one create a game where not experiencing the entire thing might no longer be an academic discussion on the way to a complete understanding of the story, but instead the only way to have a complete experience of the art? I would like to read this last example you have, but I want to give thoughts on that first, just briefly, because we don't really have time. Right. So I would agree with you for the most part. I think that these examples are quite tame. I have repeatedly criticized. I feel very critical, but I'm just trying to be honest about how I feel about them because that's why you sent me this parlay. I've been repeatedly critical of how I think the subject matter of these games is kind of pedestrian. You know, I would like to dig deeper. But it's more than that. I agree with you. I think a lot of these games are not using their structure in a very aggressive way. They're kind of doing a thing people do anyway, like just replaying the game. And the decision to kind of stop playing the game, the impossible choice of this parlay, is sort of a side effect. Like, to not play a New Game Plus, you do have to shut off the game. But it's not like because you stop playing the game. I don't know. I think that the near replicant example gets close. It does feel a little bit to me like, well, that's kind of doing the thing you're talking about. But while we definitely don't have time for me to get into it anymore, I completely agree with you. If there are going to be further Invisible Wall parlay that are essentially about like going further, having games where you like have to stop playing to do the thing, I am very interested to hear that. I'm not certain how that would work off the top of my head. The first thing that comes to mind is something like the plot makes sense only over time somehow, but also only if you stop at the right time. And then the game could do something like there is more game, but at a certain point the game asks you to stop playing, and something about the game makes sense in context over the time that you're not playing. You wait for a time gate to continue playing, but by the time that time gate in real time is up, you understand that you will no longer want to play the rest of the game. Somehow. You get to the final boss, and the final boss says you don't want to do this, and the game makes you wait 10 real days to fight the boss. During that time, the game sets you up to piece together that you really ought to not choose to fight the boss, and then you don't, and then the game is over, or you log into the game again and choose to do something you wouldn't have otherwise, but then you could have just picked to do that thing before, but you just can't make the choice until 10 days later. I don't know. Or you just leave the game behind. It feels like sort of a riddle somehow, you know what I mean? That's what I've got for now. I do want to read this last example because it's good. Mr. Food includes a bonus example, Dark Souls 1 good idea. Oof. I don't believe that the original Dark Souls is particularly innovative or good in any of its aspects. And I said I was being harsh today. Oh, baby. Hee-haw. That's a spicy meatball. I mean, I don't entirely disagree. But there is exactly one amazing idea in it. It's the fact that Jesus Christ. It's the fact that the game canonizes people who did not finish the game. In the lore, undeads, like the player character, either have a goal they work toward, or they hollow, becoming mindless zombies. And people hollow when they give up on their goal. If we apply this to the player and the goal that is beating the game Dark Souls, the parallels are apparent. This is one of the very few cases where the impossible choice is acknowledged by a piece of art. The idea is that players who didn't finish the game are not so subtly implied. I already knew about this example from my own experience to be the hollows you see in the world. And so the game taunts you a little bit, or it's kind of diegetic. It's in the game world. What happens if you do not finish the game? Implying that your character will just kind of go on doing the thing. This is interesting because it suggests that the the player outside of the game has a role in the world, a will to direct one of the undeads to finish the game. And if they were not there, then that wouldn't happen, and that would be a hollow. It's an interesting idea, incorporating more of this idea that the game not exactly goes on while you're not there, but that the player, the human player character outside of the game, has some role to play in the piece of art is interesting to me, to more thoroughly incorporate that person into the art. I want to talk more about this, but we don't have time. So great parlay. There was a ton of stuff in it. I hope I did an okay job with the time we had. Talk to you soon. Looking forward to the next one. Again, I suspect based on previous parlay that you're setting up that there is this thing that, you know, you feel means you have to not play the whole thing to get the full experience, which I'm looking forward to hearing about.